The Velixari had spent decades studying humanity from the shadows before making their first official contact. They were a species that thrived on structure, their civilization built upon the unshakable foundation of hierarchy. Orders were absolute, command was unquestionable, the higher ranks dictated and the lower ranks obeyed. This was the natural order, the way of all intelligent species. Or so they had believed. Humanity, they had thought, was no different. Their military was rigidly stratified. Generals and admirals stood at the top, giving orders that cascaded down through carefully defined ranks. Presidents and prime ministers ruled their nations with structured authority. Even outside their governments and armed forces, humans seemed to cling to hierarchy. Corporate ladders, social classes, chain of command structures in nearly every aspect of their lives. It was predictable, it was logical, it was something the Velixari could understand. So when the first expeditionary fleet of the Velixari Empire arrived in Earth's orbit and made contact with the deep space exploration vessel USC Armstrong, they expected diplomacy to follow a similarly structured path. They would speak to the human captain, the highest authority aboard the vessel, and negotiations would proceed accordingly. Admiral Zarkul, the commanding officer of the fleet, had spent years preparing for this moment. His intelligence officers had briefed him extensively on human ranks. He knew that a ship's captain was the ultimate authority on board. He knew that officers followed orders from their superiors without question. And most importantly, he knew that authority in human culture flowed from rank, not from mere knowledge. He was about to learn how deeply mistaken he was. The first unexpected deviation from his expectations occurred within the first few minutes of their interaction. Zarkul had been speaking with Captain Ethan Grayson, exchanging the usual pleasantries, when one of his own officers, Lieutenant Karesh, suddenly staggered. His breathing labored. The Velixari physiology was robust, but they had spent little time in proximity to human ships, and it seemed that something in the environment had triggered an unexpected reaction. Within moments, Kareth collapsed, his skin darkening as his body struggled to compensate for the sudden stress. Zarkul immediately turned to his medical officers, prepared to issue orders, but before he could speak, one of the humans stepped forward, moving with swift, precise determination. She was different from the others, clad in a uniform that lacked the insignia of command. Her clothing bore no rank markings, no symbols of authority. By all Velixari reasoning, she was a subordinate, a lesser officer. And yet everyone in the room turned toward her as if she had just become the most important person aboard the ship. "His vitals are destabilizing," she said without hesitation, already kneeling beside Kareth, scanning him with a handheld device. "I need him in the medbay immediately." Zarkul frowned. "Our own medics can—" "No," she interrupted, already pressing something against Kareth's neck. "You don't have time. If we don't stabilize him now, he'll be dead in 15 minutes. It took Zarkul a moment to process what had just happened. A lesser human had just interrupted him? An admiral of the Velixari Empire? Without hesitation, without fear. Worse still, no one on the human side seemed surprised. He turned to Captain Grayson, expecting the man to reprimand the subordinate for speaking out of turn. Instead, Grayson merely nodded. "Whatever you need, Doc." And just like that, the discussion was over. The woman, Dr. Evelyn Carter, as Zarkul would later learn, began issuing orders. Human crew members moved in seamless synchronization with her commands, retrieving medical equipment, preparing the necessary procedures, and relocating Kareth to the ship's medbay without even glancing at their superior officers for confirmation. The captain never intervened. He didn't reassert authority. He simply stepped aside. Zarkul followed, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was witnessing. On a Velixari vessel, this would have been unthinkable. A lower-ranked officer, especially one without military standing, would never assume control of a situation without explicit orders. Command was a privilege earned through rank, not through mere expertise. Yet here, the human captain had ceded authority, without argument, without hesitation, without even a formal transfer of command. He observed as Carter worked. Her hands were precise, her movements efficient. She issued orders with absolute confidence, and those around her responded without question. Even when one of the human officers, a lieutenant by the markings on his uniform, paused as if uncertain, Carter didn't slow down. "Now, Lieutenant," she said, without raising her voice. The officer obeyed. Immediately, Zarkul's own medical officers watched in stunned silence as she worked. It wasn't just that she was competent, it was that everyone treated her commands as though they carried the weight of an admiral's orders. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the crisis was over. Kareth stabilized, his breathing evened out. Carter stepped back, exhaling sharply before wiping her hands on a cloth. "Next time, warn us about any potential allergic responses before sending your people onto a human ship," she said, her tone dry but not unkind. "I just saved his life, but he wasn't far from multi-center failure." Zarkul stared at her, then at Captain Grayson. "You allowed her to take command." Grayson smirked. "She didn't take command, Admiral. She already had it." Zarkul's mandibles twitched in frustration. "She is not the captain. She does not outrank you." Grayson shrugged. "She's the doctor." It was such a simple statement, but it carried an implication that Zarkel found deeply unsettling. "And that grants her the authority to override your orders?" "In medical situations, absolutely." The Velixari Admiral remained silent, his mind working rapidly to reassess everything he thought he knew about human command structures. They had studied human warfare, their governmental systems, their tactical doctrines, but they had never considered that authority among humans was not solely dictated by rank. Humans, it seemed, operated on a different set of rules entirely. Expertise was authority. It wasn't just that Carter had saved a life. It was that in the moment of crisis, every human on the ship, regardless of their rank, had deferred to her without needing to be told. Even the captain, the highest-ranking officer aboard, had obeyed without question. Zarkul couldn't shake the unease creeping into his thoughts. This was not how the Velixari operated. To them, command was command, absolute and unwavering. A lesser-ranked officer would never issue orders to their superior, no matter the circumstances. And yet, these humans had created a system where authority could shift in an instant, dictated not by chain of command, but by who knew best. He exhaled slowly. "Humans are strange." Dr. Carter smirked. "Yeah, we get that a lot." It was then that Zarkul realized something even more disturbing. The Velixari had always considered their strict hierarchical structure to be a strength, an unassailable advantage in war and diplomacy. But what he had just witnessed, it was flexible, adaptable, efficient, and perhaps more powerful than anything the Velixari had ever known. Admiral Zarkul returned to his flagship with a mind heavy with unease. The encounter aboard the U.S. Armstrong had shaken something fundamental in him. Something that years of strict training and deep-seated beliefs in hierarchy had never allowed him to question. Authority was absolute. Command was given, not taken. Orders flowed downward, never upward. It was the way of the Velixari, the way of all civilized species. And yet he had seen something aboard the human vessel that defied all of that. He had seen a mere doctor assume command over higher-ranked officers, not through orders, but through something far more terrifying. Through knowledge. Even more unsettling, everyone had obeyed her without hesitation. Even the captain, the highest authority aboard the ship, had not issued an order. He had simply acknowledged that the doctor's authority was unquestionable in that moment. It was not a formalized system, not something written in their doctrine. It was an instinct, a silent understanding among the humans. And that made it even more dangerous. Zarkul stood in the central command chamber of his warship, gazing out at the human vessel through the reinforced glass. His second-in-command, Commander Velroth, entered quietly, waiting for permission to speak. Zarkul motioned for him to proceed. "The incident aboard the human ship has been analyzed," Velroth said. Lieutenant Kyroth's collapse was indeed caused by an unforeseen reaction to trace elements in the atmosphere. Had intervention been delayed by even 5 minutes, he would have suffered irreversible organ failure. Zarkul remained silent. Velaroth hesitated before continuing. Their doctor saved his life. Efficiently? Zarvo turned, narrowing his eyes. You sound almost impressed. There was a flicker of uncertainty in Velaroth's gaze, as if he too was struggling with the implications of what they had witnessed. I do not claim to understand human hierarchy, Admiral, but what I saw in that moment did not appear to be chaos. It was structured in a way I cannot define. The captain did not need to give an order. The crew did not need to be told to obey. They simply acted. Zarkul exhaled slowly. That is what troubles me, Commander. Velaroth hesitated again before speaking. With respect, Admiral, is it possible that we have misunderstood their entire system of command? That was the question that had been festering in Zarkul's mind since the encounter. They had believed that human leadership functioned like their own, static, unwavering, determined entirely by position and title. But now he was beginning to suspect that human command was fluid, shifting to whoever was most suited to lead in any given moment. And that was unpredictable. Before he could respond, an alert sounded through the command chamber, a high-priority distress signal. Zarkul immediately moved to the control console, his mandibles tightening as he scanned the incoming report. One of their warships, the Vectar, had suffered a containment breach in its reactor chamber, multiple injuries, critical systems failing. Dispatch emergency teams, Zarkul ordered. The nearest medevac vessel is 16 minutes away, Velaroth reported grimly. Zarkul's claws tapped against the console in frustration. That was too long. The reactor chamber's radiation exposure alone would prove fatal within 10 minutes. He knew what needed to be done, but the thought of it made his mandibles clench. He turned toward the viewport again, staring at the USA Armstrong. The humans would not hesitate. Moments later, Captain Grayson's face appeared on the communications screen. You don't usually call so soon after a first contact, Grayson remarked. Something tells me this isn't a social call. Zarkul forced his pride down. One of our warships has suffered a reactor breach. We have casualties. Our medical teams will not arrive in time. Grayson's face turned serious in an instant. How many injured? At least 30, possibly more. Grayson's head turned slightly, as if listening to someone off-screen. Then he nodded. We are sending our med team over now. Zarkul expected further discussion, negotiations about how humans would be allowed aboard a Velxari warship. Instead, there was none. No waiting for permission, no request for formal approval from a superior. The humans had already begun moving before the call even ended. Within minutes, Dr. Carter and her team arrived aboard the Vectar. Zarkul met them personally, though the situation left little time for formalities. The moment they stepped into the warship's medbay, the same pattern repeated itself. Dr. Carter did not ask for instructions. She did not defer to the Velxari officers. She scanned the injured and immediately took over the situation. You, she snapped, pointing at one of the Velxari medics, get me a full scan of the radiation exposure levels in this chamber. The medic hesitated, glancing at his commanding officer for confirmation. Carter's eyes darkened. Now. The medic moved. Zarkul watched, feeling the same uncomfortable sensation creeping through him. Carter was not in command of this vessel, and yet, in this moment, she was the highest authority in the room. She moved through the injured with precise efficiency, issuing orders to Velxari and human personnel alike, and they obeyed. They obeyed because she knew what needed to be done, because there was no hesitation in her voice, no room for doubt. At one point, one of Zarkul's own officers questioned her directive. Doctor, this treatment method is not standard Velxari procedure. Carter rounded on him so fast that Zarkul saw the officer recoil. Your standard procedure won't work in this case, she snapped. Unless you'd rather watch your people die, I suggest you follow my lead. Zarkul was certain the officer would resist, that he would insist on Velzari protocols, demand approval from a superior. Instead, he simply nodded and did as she commanded. Carter didn't wait for thanks. She simply kept working. Zarku realized with a sense of quiet dread that she hadn't even thought about rank. She hadn't cared who was in charge of this warship, who had the authority to give orders. The only thing that had mattered was solving the problem. And that was when he understood the full scope of what made humans so dangerous. The Velixari had spent centuries perfecting their command structure. They believed that discipline, hierarchy, and unwavering obedience were the foundation of efficiency, that control was the key to order. But humans had created something different. They had created a system where leadership could shift instantly, where expertise determined authority in the moment it was needed. On a Velzari ship, an officer would have waited for clearance before taking action. By the time approval came, more would have died. But the humans? They didn't wait. They acted. Zarkul exhaled slowly, watching as Cotter stabilized another injured officer. He had come to this encounter believing that the Velixari understood human command structures, that their own rigid hierarchy would allow them to predict and control the course of diplomacy. But now he saw the truth. The humans had no fixed structure, and that made them impossible to predict. They were adaptable, they were fast, and when the moment demanded it, they followed the one who knew best, no matter their rank. Zarkul felt a rare sensation settle over him. For the first time in years, he felt uncertain. The silence in the command chamber of the Vectar was almost suffocating. The injured had been stabilized, the reactor breach contained, and yet Admiral Zarkul felt no relief. Instead, he stood in stunned contemplation, watching as Dr. Evelyn Carter and her team moved through the medbay, checking over the recovering Velixari. It had happened again. This human, this doctor, had taken command of his warship's medical operations without rank, without orders, without so much as a formal request. She had simply assumed control, and his officers had followed her lead, not because they had been commanded to, but because, in that moment, they had recognized her as the authority. Zarkul turned away, staring at his own reflection in the metallic wall panel. His mandibles twitched in frustration. This was not how command worked. This was not how order was maintained. Yet, despite everything he had been taught, despite everything his species had built their empire upon, it had worked. His officers had obeyed her, and lives had been saved because of it. His second-in-command, Commander Velaroth, approached cautiously. He had been watching as well, witnessing every moment of the unsettling display of human flexibility. "The crew is recovering," Velaroth reported. "Final casualty count is significantly lower than projected." He hesitated before adding, "Had we relied on our own protocols, the losses would have been considerably higher." Zarkul didn't respond. The Roth shifted uncomfortably before speaking again. "Admiral, if I may." Zarkul gave a slow nod, permitting him to continue. "There is something deeply troubling about what we have witnessed," Velaroth said carefully. "I do not mean this as an insult to the humans, on the contrary. Their methods are effective." He glanced toward Carter, who was still giving instructions to the Velzari medical officers as if she had served aboard their ship for years. "But I struggle to understand how their society functions with such a fluid command structure. How do they maintain order when authority can shift so easily?" Zarkul exhaled slowly. That was the question that had been gnawing at him since their first encounter with Carter. "I do not believe their structure is as chaotic as we first assumed," Zarkul admitted. "It only appears that way to us because we have always believed authority to be an unchanging permanent fixture." Velaroth's mandibles twitched in thought. "But their captain, he still holds authority over the ship, does he not?" Zarkul considered that. "Yes, but he is willing to surrender it when necessary." He gestured toward Carter. At this moment, she holds command in this domain, not by rank but by expertise. The crew recognizes this instinctively. Even their captain understands that in matters of medicine, he is not the highest authority. Velaroth narrowed his eyes. It is unorthodox. Is adaptive, Zarkul corrected. That was the word that unsettled him the most. Adaptability. The ability to shift, to bend without breaking, to recognize in an instant who was best suited to lead at any given moment. It was unlike anything the Velexari had ever considered. On a Veljari warship, an officer followed orders without question, because hesitation in the chain of command could mean disaster. But the humans, they functioned on an entirely different principle. For them, command was not a privilege granted by rank, it was a responsibility given by necessity. He turned to Velroth, his voice quiet. We have studied human warfare. We have studied their military hierarchy. But I believe we have missed something crucial. Velaros looked at him expectantly. We assumed their strength came from their numbers, their technology, their strategic formations, but now I am beginning to understand. Zarkul's gaze darkened. Their true strength is in their ability to adapt their leadership to any situation. Velaroth stiffened. That is a terrifying thought. Yes, Zarkul murmured. It is. A sound behind them drew their attention. Carter had finished her final checks and was approaching. Her expression was tired but resolute. That's about as stable as I can get them for now, she said. Your medical teams can take it from here, but I've given them some updated procedures to follow. Zarkul eyed her carefully. You did not request permission before assuming command of my medbay. Carter blinked, then gave him a knowing smile. Nope. You did not hesitate to override my officer's medical protocols. Because they weren't going to work, she said simply. You assume my crew would obey your directives despite you holding no official rank aboard this vessel. I didn't assume, she corrected. I knew they would. Zarkul studied her in silence. You find this unsettling, don't you? Carter asked after a moment. Zarkul hesitated before answering. It contradicts everything my people believe about authority, and yet I cannot deny that it was effective. Carter nodded. That's the thing about humans. We're not just good at following orders, we're good at recognizing who should be giving them in the first place. Zarkul's mandibles clicked together. And in a crisis, that person is not always the one with the highest rank. Exactly. He exhaled slowly. That is an incredibly dangerous system. Carter grinned. That's why it works so well. Zarkul let her words settle in his mind. He had spent his entire career believing that rigid hierarchy was the only path to stability, that allowing command to shift on the fly would only lead to chaos. But now, he had seen otherwise. The humans had no rigid chain of command in times of crisis. They had something far more efficient. They had trust. It was not about rank, it was not about hierarchy. It was about the unshakable certainty that when the moment came, the right person would take charge and everyone would follow, no questions asked. Zarkul suddenly felt very, very old. His people had spent centuries perfecting a system of leadership they believed to be flawless, but now he had seen something different, something better. Carter clapped a hand on his shoulder, startling him. You're thinking really hard about this, Admiral. Zarkul gave her a measured look. Your system of leadership is unconventional. Carter laughed. Yeah, we get that a lot. Zarkul looked over at his crew. They had followed Carter's lead, and because of it, many of their fellow officers were still alive. He wondered how they felt, knowing they had obeyed a foreigner, a non-ranking individual, not out of duty, but out of necessity. Perhaps they felt the same unease that he did. Or perhaps they were beginning to understand what he was only now realizing. Carter stretched. Well, if that's all, I should be heading back to my ship. Zarkul studied her for a long moment before nodding. Doctor. She paused, turning back. Yeah? You saved many lives today, Velixari and human alike. She smiled. It's what I do. Zarkul considered his next words carefully. Then, slowly, he straightened his posture. You have my respect. Carter's expression softened. She seemed to recognize the significance of the statement. Likewise, Admiral. She turned and left with her team. Zarkul stood in silence for a long time after she was gone. Velroth eventually stepped forward. Admiral? Zarkul's voice was quiet but firm. We have much to reconsider. For the first time in his career, he saw the universe not as it had been, but as it could be. And for the first time, he wondered if perhaps the Velixari had been doing it wrong all along.